Settle in and listen. Picture the Roman Empire, not in ruins as we see it today, but as it was, a living, breathing colossus of marble and iron whose eagles cast a shadow across the known world. It was meant to be eternal. We are told its end was a storm of fire and steel, a thunderous clash of legions against barbarian hordes. But that is only the final, violent chapter of a much longer, quieter story. A story of an empire not murdered by an outside force, but one that slowly, silently, poisoned itself from within. What if the true cause of death was not the barbarian's sword, but the crumbling of a coin in a merchant's hand, the silent falling of the last tree on a barren Italian hillside, the quiet apathy in a soldier's heart? Tonight we do not look at the flames that brought the walls down. We search for the cracks in the foundation, the unseen forces that doomed the eternal city long before the first enemy ever crossed its borders. Our story begins not on a battlefield, but in a place far more crucial to the lifeblood of an empire, the marketplace. It begins with something you could hold in the palm of your hand, a single coin. To a Roman citizen in the age of the great emperors like Trajan or Marcus Aurelius, a silver denarius was more than just money. It was a promise. It was a small, circular piece of certainty in a vast and often chaotic world. Stamped with the face of the emperor, it was a tangible link to the power and stability of Rome itself. This coin, nearly pure silver, could travel from the misty shores of Britain to the sun-scorched sands of Syria, and its value would be recognized, trusted, and accepted. A legionary on Hadrian's Wall was paid in the same reliable currency as a merchant in Alexandria. This trust, this universal faith in a piece of metal, was one of the fundamental pillars upon which the Roman world was built. It powered trade, funded armies, and gave a common man the ability to save for the future, secure in the knowledge that his hard-earned money would be worth the same tomorrow as it was today. It was the hum of commerce, the engine of prosperity, the symbol of an order that seemed destined to last for 1,000 years. But empires are expensive, immensely so. The very things that projected Roman power also bled its treasury dry. A standing army of 500,000 men, stationed along thousands of miles of frontier, required a constant, staggering flow of funds for wages, equipment, and supplies. The grand architectural projects that defined Rome's skyline, the Colosseum, the aqueducts, the sprawling bathhouses, were monuments built on mountains of coin. The famous bread and circuses, the free grain and public games used to keep the teeming population of Rome content, was another relentless drain. For a time, during the great conquests, the system worked. New provinces brought new taxes, and vanquished enemies yielded vast quantities of gold and silver to be minted into new currency. But what happens when the empire stops expanding? What happens when there are no new mountains of treasure to plunder, yet the expenses continue to grow? This was the silent crisis that began to creep into the halls of power. The river of new wealth had slowed to a trickle, but the thirst of the imperial machine was unquenchable. The state's balance sheet was slowly, invisibly, beginning to bleed. The first emperor to devise a truly insidious solution to this problem was Nero. Faced with the enormous cost of rebuilding Rome after the Great Fire and his own famously lavish lifestyle, Nero made a fateful decision. He could not simply create more silver out of thin air, but he could stretch the silver he already had. The command was given to the imperial mints. Take the old, pure silver coins from circulation, melt them down, and reissue them with a small, almost imperceptible amount of a cheaper base metal, like copper, mixed in. For every 10 pure coins melted down, the mint could now produce 11 or perhaps 12. This extra coin was pure profit for the state, a phantom wealth created by alchemy of state. On the surface, nothing had changed. The new denarius looked the same. It felt the same. The emperor's face was still on it. But its intrinsic worth, its very soul, had been compromised. It was a secret sin, a betrayal of the promise stamped into the metal. At first the change was so minor, only the most astute money changers might have noticed. The Roman economy, for the moment, did not react. Nero had found a magic money tree, and a dangerous precedent had been set. What begins as a convenient trick soon becomes a desperate addiction. Subsequent emperors, especially during the chaotic period known as the crisis of the 3rd century, turned to Nero's secret with increasing frequency and recklessness. During this 50-year span, the empire was racked by constant civil war. Emperors rose and fell with terrifying speed, often proclaimed by their legions and assassinated by them just a few years or even months later. These were the barracks emperors, men who ruled by the sword alone. And a soldier's loyalty is a commodity that must be purchased. Each new emperor, upon taking the throne, had to pay a massive bonus to the soldiers who elevated him, and then continue to pay them to keep them from elevating someone else. With the empire in chaos, tax collection was sporadic, and trade was disrupted. The only way to get the money needed to secure power was to make it. And so the mints worked day and night, melting and reminting, with each new issue containing less silver and more copper than the last.
Let us follow the tragic decline of the denarius, the coin that built the empire. Under Nero, it was perhaps 95% silver. By the time of Marcus Aurelius, a philosopher king who fought grueling wars on the Danube, it had dropped to around 75%, a noticeable decline, but still a coin of substance. Then came the crisis. Under emperors like Gallienus, who battled invaders from every direction while usurpers tore the empire apart from within, the so-called silver coin might contain only 5% silver. It was, in reality, a copper coin given a thin, deceptive wash of silver that would rub off after only a few weeks in circulation. The promise was not just broken, it had become a blatant lie. The government was engaged in mass counterfeiting of its own currency. Imagine the effect this had on the average person. Imagine being a shopkeeper in Rome. A soldier comes in to buy a loaf of bread and some wine. He pays you with the newly minted coins his legion was just given. You look at them. They feel too light. They do not have the familiar, reassuring ring of true silver when tapped on your counter. They have a dull, lifeless thud. You know you are being cheated, but what can you do? This is the official currency, bearing the emperor's seal. To refuse it would be treason. So you accept it, and to make up for the loss, you are forced to raise your prices. The next day, the soldier returns and finds that the same number of coins now buys him less. He feels cheated. He grows angry. Now multiply this small scene by millions, every day, in every market, in every city and town, from Gaul to Egypt. This is the birth of hyperinflation. Trust, the invisible glue of any economy, evaporated. People began to hoard the old coins, the heavy, silver-rich denarii of previous generations, refusing to spend them. The good money vanished from circulation, leaving only the bad, debased currency in its place. The common wisdom became, spend the new, worthless coins as fast as you can, before they lose even more value, and save the old, good ones. Long-distance trade, once a marvel of the Roman world, became a high-risk gamble. Why would a merchant in Spain send a cargo of olive oil to Italy, knowing he would be paid in coins that might be worthless by the time he received them. It was safer to trade locally, or, better yet, not to use money at all. The economy began to regress. Farmers would rather trade a sack of wheat directly for a new pair of sandals than sell it for a pocketful of junk metal. The empire was slowly, painfully, sliding back towards a primitive barter system. The sophisticated financial network that had taken centuries to build was unraveling. The social consequences were devastating. The wealthy elite, whose fortunes were primarily in land and property, were largely insulated from the currency crisis. But the middle class, the merchants, the civil servants, the skilled craftsmen were destroyed. Their life savings, held in currency, became meaningless. The soldiers who were supposedly benefiting from the endless minting found that their rising wages were a mirage, as prices rose even faster. This created a permanent state of resentment and instability. It fueled the cycle of violence, as legions would murder their emperor simply to install a new one who promised them a fresh payout of newly minted, and thus newly devalued coins. The emperor Diocletian, a stern and brilliant general who rose to power at the end of the crisis, saw the economic chaos and tried to stop it by sheer force of will. He introduced a new set of coins with standardized metal content, but his most famous measure was the Edict on Maximum Prices in the year 301. This decree set a fixed price for thousands of goods and services across the empire. A pound of beef, a pint of wine, a day's labor for a stonemason, all now had a legal maximum price. The penalty for violating the edict was death. It was a dramatic, authoritarian attempt to halt inflation by making it illegal, and it was a catastrophic failure. Producers and merchants found that the government-mandated prices were often below their own costs. It was no longer profitable to bring goods to market, so they disappeared. Widespread shortages ensued. A vibrant black market emerged, where goods were sold illegally at realistic, inflated prices. The edict, meant to restore order, only drove commerce further into the shadows and created more misery. It was eventually abandoned, a testament to the fact that an economy cannot be governed by threats. The damage was too deep. The poison of debasement had worked its way through every vein and artery of the Roman world. The state had stolen the wealth of its people through inflation, and in doing so, it had shattered their faith. The economic foundation of the empire, once as solid as granite, had been hollowed out, leaving behind a fragile, brittle shell. The true wealth of Rome was not in its gold, but in the trust of its citizens. And that trust was now gone, lost in a flood of worthless metal. The decay we have just witnessed, the hollowing out of the empire's currency, was not happening in isolation. It was a symptom of a deeper philosophy that had taken root in Rome, a belief in limitless growth and infinite resources. The same short-sighted desperation that led emperors to dilute their silver also led them to wage a silent, undeclared war upon the natural world. If the financial crisis was a poison in the empire's veins, then the environmental crisis was a sickness in its very bones and flesh. It was a slow, creeping exhaustion, a debt being charged against the land, the water, and the air. And for this debt, posterity would be forced to pay a terrible price. To understand this, we must shift our gaze from the crowded forum to the quiet, stripped hillsides of Italy, and listen to a story told not in coins, but in eroded soil and vanished forests in its youth. The Italian peninsula was a land of deep, primordial forests. Ancient writers spoke of vast woodlands, so dense that a squirrel could supposedly travel from one end of the peninsula to the other without ever touching the ground. These forests were home to wolves, bears, and a vibrant ecosystem that had existed for millennia. To the early Romans, this endless sea of green was a gift from the gods, a source of boundless wealth. But to the later Roman Empire, a sprawling, industrial, and military superpower, the forests were not a sacred grove, but a standing reserve of raw material, there to be consumed. The empire's hunger for wood was astonishing, almost incomprehensible to the modern mind. First and foremost, wood was fuel. It was the oil and electricity of the ancient world. The city of Rome alone had over 900 public bathhouses, some of them gargantuan complexes, like the baths of Caracalla, which could accommodate thousands of people at once. These were not simply places to bathe. They were social hubs with libraries, gyms, and gardens, and they all required constant, monumental heat. Enormous furnaces, burning day and night, consumed entire forests just to heat the water and the very floors of these establishments. Beyond the baths, would fuel the fires of industry, the smelting of iron for the millions of swords, helmets, and spearheads that equipped the legions required immense quantities of charcoal, which is made from wood. The forges of blacksmiths, the kilns of potters firing countless amphorae to transport wine and oil, the furnaces of glass blowers, all demanded a constant supply, the domestic needs of millions of citizens cooking their daily meals simply added to this staggering demand. Then there was construction. The apartment blocks, temples, and civic buildings that filled Roman cities were built with brick and concrete. But their internal structures, their floors, scaffolding, and roofs were made of massive wooden beams. The sprawling villas of the rich and the frontier forts of the legions were likewise dependent on timber. But perhaps the most voracious consumer of all was the Roman navy and its vast merchant marine. A single Roman warship required thousands of mature oak trees. A fleet built to fight a war against Carthage or to clear the Mediterranean of pirates could mean the leveling of entire mountain ranges. Wood was the essential material of Roman power, and for centuries they harvested it with brutal efficiency, with little thought for replenishment. The consequences of this relentless deforestation played out over generations. A slow-motion disaster, as the hillsides of Italy, Greece, and the coastal regions of the Mediterranean were stripped bare, the land itself began to die. Trees act as a natural anchor, their roots holding the precious topsoil in place. Without them, there was nothing to stop the torrential winter rains from washing the earth away. The soil, the fertile foundation of agriculture for centuries, was carried down the slopes into the rivers. This led to two devastating effects. First, the farmland that remained became less fertile, its life force bleeding into the waterways. Second, the rivers themselves, now choked with silt and sediment, began to clog up. They became shallower, more prone to overflowing their banks, leading to more frequent and destructive floods in the valleys below. The silting of rivers also created a critical logistical nightmare. The port of Ostia, at the mouth of the Tiber River, was the lifeline of Rome. It was through Ostia that the enormous grain shipments that fed the capital arrived. But as the Tiber became increasingly clogged with soil washed down from the deforested hills upstream, the harbour became a treacherous maze of sandbars and shallow channels. Roman engineers fought a constant, losing battle, dredging the harbour and eventually being forced to build a massive new artificial port complex nearby. It was a heroic effort, but it was a treatment of the symptom, not the disease. The empire was spending a fortune to combat a problem it had created, a problem born of its own insatiable consumption. The land itself was protesting, silently fighting back. This exhaustion was not limited to the forests. It was happening in the fields as well. Roman agriculture was, in many ways, very sophisticated, but it was often driven by the economics of the latifundia. Vast agricultural estates owned by the wealthy elite and worked by slaves or tenant farmers. These estates often focused on cash crops, particularly wheat, to feed the cities. Year after year, the same fields were planted with the same crop. This practice of monoculture farming slowly leaches specific, vital nutrients from the soil. Over time, yields begin to fall. A field that once produced 100 bushels of wheat now produces 70, then 50, then even less. The Romans understood the concept of letting land lie fallow, but the economic pressures of the late empire often made this impossible. The demand for grain was constant and unforgiving. As the soil of Italy grew tired and depleted, Rome became dangerously dependent on its overseas provinces. The fertile lands of North Africa and, above all, the timeless bounty of the Nile Valley in Egypt became the breadbaskets of the empire. This dependence created a critical strategic vulnerability. The fate of the capital city, the political heart of the empire, rested on the safe and timely arrival of the grain fleet from Alexandria. A series of bad storms, a war in the eastern Mediterranean, or a revolt in Egypt, could sever this lifeline and lead to famine and riots in the streets of Rome. The state was no longer self-sufficient. It had outsourced its most basic need, its daily bread, and in doing so, had placed a knife to its own throat, to be held by the hand of fortune. Finally, there was a form of pollution so pervasive, so integrated into Roman life, that its effects were likely never truly understood at the time. It was the slow, chronic poison of lead. The Romans were brilliant plumbers and engineers, and their aqueducts are a testament to their genius. But the vast network of pipes that carried water through their cities was often made of lead. They mined lead on an industrial scale, particularly in the rich mines of Spain. The process of smelting the ore released plumes of lead-laden smoke into the atmosphere. Modern science has given us a startling window into this past. Ice cores drilled in the glaciers of Greenland show a clear, dramatic spike in lead pollution in the layers corresponding to the height of the Roman Empire. A level of contamination not seen again until the Industrial Revolution nearly 2 millennia later. Lead was everywhere. It was used to solder pipes and line cooking pots. The wealthy drank from lead-based pewter goblets. Most insidiously, a lead-based syrup, known as sapa, was commonly used as an artificial sweetener for food and cheap wine. It was sweet to the taste, but it was a potent neurotoxin. While the dramatic theory that lead poisoning single-handedly destroyed the Roman elite is likely an exaggeration, we cannot ignore the probable effects of long-term low-level lead exposure on a massive scale. It can cause a host of health problems, including infertility, gout, and cognitive decline. It is another invisible enemy, another internal weakness, slowly sapping the vitality of the Roman people. From the emperor in his palace drinking sweetened wine to the commoner drinking water from a lead pipe. The very infrastructure that marked Roman greatness was also a source of a slow, creeping sickness. Thus, the magnificent edifice of the Roman Empire was standing on a foundation that was quite literally eroding away beneath it. The consumption that fueled its grandeur was simultaneously its undoing. The clear-cutting of its forests led to floods and crippled its harbors. The The over-farming of its soil created a perilous dependency that weakened its strategic position. The materials and methods used to build its cities and sustain its lifestyle introduced a slow poison into its population. These were not the actions of an invading army. These were self-inflicted wounds, born of a failure to see the limits of the world they inhabited. The empire was becoming a giant, weakened by malnutrition and chronic illness, increasingly vulnerable to any outside shock that might come its way. The corrosion of Rome's economy and the exhaustion of its lands were not merely logistical or agricultural problems. They were the physical symptoms of a much deeper malady, a sickness of the spirit. An empire is more than just borders on a map or buildings made of stone. It is a collective idea, a shared story that its people tell themselves. It is a belief in a common identity, a common purpose. For centuries, the idea of being Roman, of civis Romanus, sum, was one of the most powerful forces on earth. It carried with it a sense of pride, of belonging to the greatest civilization the world had ever known. But as the coins in their purses became worthless and the farmlands their ancestors had tilled turned to dust, this powerful idea began to fracture. The story was changing. The belief was starting to fade. Our journey now takes us away from the tangible world of metal and soil, and into the hearts and minds of the people themselves, to witness the slow, tragic unraveling of the Roman soul. This spiritual decay was most visible in the institution that had forged the empire and guaranteed its existence, the army. The legionary of the early empire, the disciplined, tenacious soldier who had conquered the world, was himself a product of the Roman soil. He was typically a citizen, often a small farmer, who had a direct, personal stake in the security of the state. He fought for his own hearth and home, for a society that he felt a part of. But the empire he and his ancestors had built grew into a vast, multicultural entity, and the nature of military service changed with it. A 25-year tour of duty on the cold, damp frontiers of Germany or Britain held little appeal for a young man from the sunny hills of Tuscany, who might have other opportunities. The very success of the empire made the gritty work of defending it less attractive to its core population. And so, the legions began to change, slowly at first, and then dramatically. The ranks began to fill with men from the provinces, and then, increasingly, with men from outside the empire's borders altogether. Goths, Franks, Vandals, Alemanni, the very barbarian peoples whom Rome had fought for centuries, were now invited to enlist in its armies. This process, often called the barbarization of the military, was a practical solution to a chronic manpower shortage. These new recruits were often superb warriors, fierce and loyal on the battlefield. But their loyalty was of a different kind. A German tribesman, fighting under a Roman standard on the Persian frontier, felt no innate connection to the city of Rome, a place he would never see. He did not fight for the abstract glory of the Senate and the Roman people. He fought for the general who led him, for the promise of good pay, for a grant of land upon retirement, and for the honor of his comrades in arms. The army transformed from a national institution into a professional, and largely mercenary, fighting force. The emperors of the late empire understood this perfectly. Their survival depended not on the consent of the Senate, but on their ability to keep the soldiers paid and happy. The military became the true power in the state, a dangerous and fickle kingmaker. The consequences of this shift were profound. The traditional Roman disciplines and tactics, which had been honed over centuries, began to erode, replaced by the fighting styles of the new recruits. The army became a reflection not of Roman society, but of the Germanic and Gallic cultures from which its soldiers were drawn. The very defenders of the empire no longer looked, spoke, or fought like the Romans of old. They were, in a sense, a foreign army occupying their own territory. Rome had outsourced its own defense, and in doing so, had placed its fate in the hands of men who had little reason to love it, and every reason to seize power for themselves if the opportunity arose. While the army was becoming less Roman, the empire's ruling class was engaged in its own form of secession. The senatorial aristocracy, the fabulously wealthy landowners whose ancestors had once governed the Republic, began a slow retreat from public life. As the political situation in the cities grew more chaotic and the demands of the imperial tax collectors became more rapacious, these elites abandoned their urban palaces. They withdrew to their vast country estates, the latifundia, and began to transform them into fortified, self-sufficient worlds unto themselves. These were not merely luxurious villas. They were the precursors to medieval castles. They had their own workshops, their own food production, and, most importantly, their own private armies of bodyguards and retainers. This withdrawal was a quiet but devastating vote of no confidence in the future of the Roman state. The men who possessed the most wealth, education, and influence were effectively abandoning their civic duties. They used their immense power and legal expertise to find loopholes to avoid paying the crushing taxes that supported the army and the bureaucracy, shifting the burden onto the already struggling middle and lower classes. They no longer sought positions in the imperial administration or sponsored public works in their cities. Their ambition was no longer to serve the empire, but to insulate their families and their fortunes from its decay. A deep and unbridgeable chasm opened up between the interests of the super-rich and the interests of the state. While the emperor struggled to find enough revenue to pay the barbarian soldiers defending the frontiers, the wealthiest citizens were hoarding their gold in their country's strongholds, contributing nothing. They were creating a shadow state, a series of private fiefdoms, where the emperor's authority was nominal at best. The very concept of a common good, a shared responsibility for the health of the Republic, was dying. And what of the common person? What did it mean to be a Roman in this fractured world? In the year 212, the Emperor Caracalla issued a decree known as the Antonine Constitution. On the surface, it was a momentous and generous act. It granted Roman citizenship to nearly every free person living within the empire's borders. Millions of people, from Scottish farmers to Arabian traders, became Roman citizens overnight. But the motive behind this act was not generosity. It was fiscal desperation. Certain taxes, like the inheritance tax, could only be levied on Roman citizens. By making everyone a citizen, Caracalla vastly expanded the state's tax base. The unintended consequence of this act was the final devaluation of Roman identity. For centuries, citizenship had been a prized and hard-won privilege. It conferred legal rights, status, and a sense of belonging. Now it was universal, and in being everywhere, it meant nothing. It was no longer a badge of honor, but simply an indication that you were on the tax rolls. For the average peasant or craftsman, life did not improve. Instead, he found himself subject to a vast, impersonal, and often brutal imperial bureaucracy. He was a cog in a machine that seemed to exist only to extract wealth from him, to fund wars in distant lands he had never heard of. His connection to the emperor was not one of reverence, but of fear of the tax collector. Apathy became a rational response to a state that gave little and took much. Why should a farmer in Gaul feel a patriotic duty to defend an empire that had tied him and his children to the land as virtual serfs to ensure its tax revenue? And so, the great unifying idea of Rome dissolved. The empire was no longer a cohesive whole. It had become a fragile shell, containing three separate and disconnected worlds. There was the world of the army, a multicultural meritocracy of soldiers, loyal mostly to their commanders. There was the world of the isolated soubrette, who lived in a gilded bubble of private luxury, divorced from the fate of the state. And there was the world of the vast majority, the common people, disengaged, overtaxed, and apathetic, for whom the grand titles of Rome and Emperor had ceased to have any meaningful resonance. The empire still stood, its borders were still defended, but its inner strength, its social cohesion, its very soul, had faded away. There was no longer a unified people to defend it, only a collection of individuals and groups trying to survive its slow, inexorable collapse. The unraveling we have witnessed, this slow decay of currency, land, and identity, did not happen in a vacuum of power. The Roman state was not a passive observer to its own decline. On the contrary, as the inner cohesion of the empire weakened, the state reacted by becoming larger, more complex, and more brutally controlling, in a desperate, centuries-long effort to hold the fracturing world together. The emperors and their administrators built a vast, intricate machine of governance, but this machine, intended to be a buttress against chaos, became a crushing weight upon the very people it was meant to protect. Its gears were oiled with the sweat and treasure of the citizenry, and its relentless hum was the sound of freedom slowly dying. This is the story of how the Roman state, in its attempt to save the empire, created a gilded cage so heavy that it ultimately helped bring the entire structure crashing down. The architect of this new state was the Emperor Diocletian, a man who came to power at the end of the nightmarish 3rd century crisis. He saw an empire on the brink of dissolution, too vast to be governed by a single man, and constantly torn apart by usurpers. His solution was both radical and logical. He divided the empire. He created the tetrarchy, the rule of 4, splitting the Roman world into an eastern and western half, each governed by a senior emperor, an Augustus, and a junior emperor, a Caesar. In the short term, the reform was a resounding success. It stabilized the frontiers, crushed rebellions, and provided for an orderly succession. But it came at a staggering cost. By creating 4 imperial courts instead of 1, Diocletian quadrupled the administrative burden. Each emperor needed his own lavish palace, his own army of civil servants, his own praetorian guard, and his own complex bureaucracy to manage his quadrant of the empire. This was the beginning of the Dominate, a new phase of Roman history. The old fiction of the emperor as the first citizen among equals was swept away. Diocletian and his successors adopted the titles of Dominus et Deus, Lord and God. They became remote, divine figures, shrouded in the elaborate ceremony of an Eastern-style court. Access to the emperor was a complex ritual involving layers of officials and eunuchs. This was not mere vanity. It was a deliberate political strategy to elevate the emperor above the fray of military coups, to make him an unassailable, godlike figure. But this divinity required an immense and costly apparatus to support it. The civil service exploded in size, creating a new, permanent class of administrators, scribes, accountants, and secret police, all of whom had to be paid from the state treasury. This ever-expanding army and the even faster expanding bureaucracy needed a constant, predictable source of revenue. The old haphazard tax system was no longer sufficient, so the state created a new one, a marvel of bureaucratic ingenuity and human misery known as the capitation. For the first time, the government sought to create a comprehensive budget. It calculated its total expected expenses for the year, and then it imposed a tax burden on the empire sufficient to meet that need. To do this, it conducted a massive census, a detailed inventory of the empire's total productive capacity. Every plot of land was assessed for its size and quality, its ugam. Every person, every peasant, every farm animal was counted as a unit of labor, a caput. The state now knew, in excruciating detail, the total wealth of its subjects. The system's logic was relentless. The state's demand was absolute. It did not matter if a province suffered from drought, or if a plague swept through a village, or if a barbarian raid destroyed the harvest. The tax assessment for that region was fixed, and it had to be paid. The tragic figures at the heart of this system were the local city councillors, the class of men known as the curiales. These were the local elites, the doctors, lawyers, and landowners who had traditionally seen public service as an honor. The late Roman state turned this honor into a hereditary curse. The curiales of a town were made personally responsible for collecting the full amount of the imperial tax assessment for their territory. If the farmers could not pay, if the harvest failed, if people fled, the curiales had to make up the immense shortfall from their own private fortunes. We have records of men who went from being the wealthiest citizens in their town to utter bankruptcy in a single year. Men would try to flee, to hide, to join the army or the clergy, anything to escape the ruinous burden of being a town councillor. The state responded by passing laws, making their position a hereditary and inescapable duty. The very class of provincial leaders upon whom the empire should have depended was systematically crushed. Faced with these crushing and inescapable taxes, the common people reacted in the only way they could. They fled. Small farmers, who for generations had owned and worked their own land, found that the tax bill was often greater than the total value of their harvest. Their choice was a stark one: stay and starve, or abandon the land their ancestors had cleared and seek survival elsewhere. Many became outlaws, bandits who haunted the roadways, turning against the state that had dispossessed them. But most sought a new kind of security. They fled to the great fortified villas of the senatorial elite, the same aristocrats who were dodging taxes themselves. They would surrender their land and their freedom to the local magnate in exchange for protection. Protection not from barbarians, but from the Roman tax collector. The state saw this happening. It saw its tax base shrinking and its population in flight. And it responded with a terrifying series of laws designed to lock society into place. If farmers were leaving their land, the state would make it illegal for them to leave. Thus was born the colonus, the tenant farmer who was legally bound to the soil. He was not a slave who could be bought and sold individually, but he was not a free man. He was an appendage of the land. If the estate was sold, he and his children were sold with it. His fate was tied to the plot of earth he worked forever. This was the birth of serfdom in Europe, created by the Roman state in a desperate bid to keep the agricultural machine running. This freezing of society spread to every profession deemed essential to the state. The son of a soldier was now required by law to become a soldier. The son of a baker who baked bread for the state-run distribution system had to become a baker. Men who worked in the imperial mints or fabrique, the state arms factories, were branded, literally branded, like cattle. to prevent them from fleeing their harsh and inescapable labor. Shipowners who transported the vital grain supplies were bound to their trade for life, as were their sons. The Roman world, once characterized by a certain degree of social mobility and economic dynamism, was becoming a rigid caste system. Your fate was determined by your birth, not by your ambition, because the state could not afford for you to be anything other than what it needed you to be. This was the ultimate paradox. The Roman state, in its monumental effort to preserve itself, had to extinguish the very Roman concept of liberty. It had to crush the provincial middle class, bind its farmers to the land, and lock its workers into hereditary professions. The bureaucracy, which had been created to serve the empire, had become a self-perpetuating entity whose own survival was paramount. The average citizen no longer saw the state as a protector, the guarantor of Pax Romana. They saw it as a distant, predatory entity, a source of endless demands and crushing burdens. The relationship between the ruler and the ruled was no longer one of mutual obligation. It was one of master and servant. The empire was stable, yes, but it was the stability of a prison yard. The inner vitality of Roman society, its creative and commercial energies, were suffocated under the immense, deadening weight of this bureaucratic machine. The empire was no longer a living organism. It was a fossil, perfectly preserved in its final, rigid form, waiting for the slightest external pressure to shatter it into dust. And so we arrive at the final act, the scene which history books present as the end of the story. The year is 476. A Germanic chieftain named Odoacer, leading an army of barbarian troops in Roman service, deposes the last emperor of the West, a young boy, ironically, named Romulus Augustus. Odoacer does not even bother to name a successor. He simply sends the imperial regalia, the diadem and the purple robe, to the Eastern emperor in Constantinople, with a message that a single emperor was now sufficient for the world. In the grand sweep of history, this moment is recorded as the fall of the Roman Empire. It is a dramatic, definitive date, but as we have seen, it was not the fall. It was merely a quiet, almost perfunctory, tidying up of a house that had been empty for a very long time. The great Colossus had been dead for a century. This was simply the moment the world agreed to stop pretending it was still breathing. The men who breached the frontiers in the 5th century, the Goths, the Vandals, the Franks, were not the cause of Rome's death. They were merely its inheritors. They were the scavengers that came to feast on a carcass, not the mighty hunters who brought the great beast down. For the beast had already killed itself, undone by 1,000 internal wounds inflicted over the course of generations. It was undone by the silent alchemy in the imperial mints, which turned the silver promise of the denarius into a copper lie, shattering the trust that bound the economy together. It was undone by the relentless stripping of its own lands, the felling of its forests and the exhaustion of its soil, a slow-motion act of self-consumption that left it strategically vulnerable and dependent on outsiders for its daily bread. The empire's foundations had been washed away by the very rivers it had choked with the soil of its own hillsides. It was undone by a crisis of the soul, a fading of the powerful idea of what it meant to be Roman. Its armies, once filled with citizen soldiers, had become a mercenary force of foreigners with no deep loyalty to the state they were paid to defend. Its elites, the natural leaders of society, had retreated into their fortified private worlds, abandoning the concept of a shared public good. And its people, granted a citizenship that had been rendered meaningless, had become apathetic subjects of a vast and predatory state. their patriotism eroded by endless taxes and a loss of personal freedom. The powerful sinews of social cohesion that had held the empire together had dissolved, leaving behind a brittle skeleton. And finally, it was undone by the crushing weight of its own complexity. The vast bureaucratic machine, built by emperors like Diocletian to enforce order, had become a monster that devoured its own creator. In its desperate quest for control and revenue, it had stifled commerce, extinguished social mobility, and bound its people in chains of hereditary obligation. The Roman state had become the enemy of the Roman people. It offered security, but it was the grim security of a prison, and its citizens were no longer willing or able to pay the price for their own incarceration. Rome's demise, therefore, was not a sudden event. It was a slow, creeping, multifaceted process. For the people who lived through it, there was no single moment of collapse, but rather a long, painful grinding down, a gradual darkening of their world. They saw their savings become worthless. They saw their farms fail. They saw their sons conscripted into an army from which they might never return. They saw their freedoms curtailed by an endless stream of imperial decrees. They did not understand that these were all symptoms of the same systemic disease. They only knew that life was growing harder, more precarious, and more fearful. The barbarians at the gate were, in many ways, the least of their worries. And in this, the story of Rome ceases to be a tale of the ancient world and becomes a timeless, universal warning. It whispers to us across the centuries, a melancholy echo from a fallen civilization. It asks us to consider the fragility of our own complex systems. It reminds us that trust, once broken, is almost impossible to repair. It shows us that short-term consumption can lead to long-term, irreversible environmental decline. It illustrates how societies begin to unravel when the gap between the powerful and the powerless becomes too great, and when the concept of a shared identity is lost. And it stands as the ultimate monument to the truth that a state that loses the consent and faith of its people, however powerful it may seem, is built on nothing more than sand. The ruins of the Roman Forum, the shattered arches and broken columns standing silent under the Italian sun, are more than just a memorial to a lost empire. They are a testament to the fact that the greatest threats to any civilization are rarely the enemies beyond its borders. The greatest threats are almost always the slow, corrosive, and often invisible decay that happens from within. The Roman Empire was not murdered. In the end, it simply became too heavy, too hollowed out, too exhausted to continue standing. And in its long and silent fall, it left a lesson for all of humanity, for all of time. Our journey through the silent fall of Rome is now complete, but the echoes of its collapse are a lesson that history intended for us to learn, even if it was buried beneath stories of conquest and glory. This is the very heart of forbidden law, to unearth the truths that time has forgotten, and that power has tried to hide. If this exploration has given you a new perspective, show your support with a like. And in the comments below, I would be honored to read your thoughts. Which of these unseen factors do you find most compelling? To continue our expeditions into the archives of the forbidden, make sure you subscribe and ring the bell. There are so many more whispers waiting to be heard. Thank you for listening. Stay curious.